This is Yinka from Sabatta, of course, and I'm here in the run-up to Halloween. It's Halloween at the end of the week. And I'm going to be dropping a tune called Creature of the Night to celebrate. I'm also going to be dropping videos as per stuff you've seen on my various channels. So I thought I'd do a little rundown, countdown, if you will, up until the day. And I thought what I'd do is use this opportunity to indulge with you one of my longest running and probably one of the interests closest to my heart, which is horror movies. I'm a big movie fan. If you know me, you know I'm a big movie fan. If you really know me, you know I'm really a big horror movie fan. So with no further ado, I'm going to kick off this list. There's 5 films in this list. These are not the top 5 films, but these are definitely, all 5 of these films are definitely top films to me. Now, also just want to say that in this list there's going to be a couple of double hitters, meaning that there's going to be a couple of films that I'm going to talk about that have 2 versions of them. And with the first entry into the list, you're going to see that. So, film number 5 is Nosferatu by Robert Eggers. Came out in 2024. It's a remake of Werner Marnuau's 1922 classic Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror. Now, I saw both of these films in the cinema. Robert Eggers' version, which also stars Johnny Depp's daughter, I saw in Leicester Square, and then I saw Werner Marnuau's version in South Bank. And I think actually they had a little, had an orchestra pit. I'm trying to remember, I think they had a little ensemble playing music along with it. So, how I usually rate horror films is, well, first off, for it to be a horror film, it has to have some kind of supernatural element, for my money. I don't like, kind of goes into the point I was going to go into, so I'll just jump into it. I don't like horror films in general, usually, that have a subtext. There's a lot of subtext horror films that have come out recently. What I mean by that is, it's a film that's meant to be a horror film, but the promo people, the directors and filmmakers themselves will be at pains to let you know that the film isn't really about, the top storyline. It's actually about something different. And it's almost as if what's happened is that, a filmmaker may have had higher aspirations, but couldn't get their movie funded. So they've gone to do a genre movie where they may have been able to get funds, and then they've almost by stealth snuck in this idea that they originally wanted to talk about. So I don't like horror films that aren't really horror films. I also, as I say, don't like, in general, subtext horror films, which is what the films I just described tend to be. However, in the case of Nosferatu 2024 and 1922, we have to actually put on the table that this is in fact, both films are in fact versions of Bram Stoker's late 19th century novel Dracula. And in that book, as with the films, there's a strong undercurrent. Now, the main story and what so many interpretations of the story have focused on is the seductive powers of the fiend Dracula, or in this case, Nosferatu, seducing women. I mean, it's actually quite interesting now to talk about it, because essentially he's the stereotypical immigrant who's taking our women. And that is a strong thematic part of the story. But obviously, running in tandem with that, and in order for that to exist, you have to have the attitudes and the feelings of the English roses, or I guess German in the case of Nosferatu. Um, anyway, it doesn't really matter. What type of rose? A rose by any other name. Anyway, the feelings of the women involved obviously have something to do with it and should do. And I think that one of the things I like about Nosferatu 2024 is that that's really highlighted and brought to the forefront by the character played, and I would say embodied by Lily Rose Depp. And I think it's conveyed really well. I mean, the subtext in this one, which, as I say, is actually part of the novel in the first place, so it's fine. It actually is what the story is about, is who controls the sexuality, especially physically, but also mentally, of late 19th century women. And a huge amount of fear um, is present in that society, i.e., the men of that society. And essentially, the performance Miss Depp gives is of literally what would have been termed a nymphomaniac. So she's got sexual fantasies, or this is obviously how it's seen by the men and the physicians around her initially. She has these insane sexual fantasies, and it's causing a huge problem. And then also there's the side of the male repression, especially in British society, English society. This is, you know, sexual repression and attitudes are something that have, since I've been around, I've always been aware that there's a thing about Englishness and sex and issues with it. So that's also explored. Anyway, I wouldn't say I digress, but I just kind of got into the weeds with that. But I think that's one of the things that I like particularly about the film, that they actually address that. And I think they do it in an intelligent and a clever way. I don't think it's corny or too, as they say, on the nose. Well, not for me at least. And then, of course, there's this kind of love story, but it's really a story of toxicity, again, which, resounds and resonates with modern day conversations, but, it's always been there. And there's a sense of sorrow and mourning and loss at the actual end of the film, which I would say in the 2024 version, which I would say isn't really present in Marnuau's 22 version. In 1922 version, it's actually a sense of relief that you get at the end of the film. I didn't feel that sense of relief at the end of Eggers' version, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think both versions are more than satisfactory, and I felt fulfilled and satisfied in watching them. What I would say is that throughout the Eggers versions, there are homages, i.e., scenes that are directly lifted from Marnau's version. And there's one particularly iconic scene that, let's say, involves travel, that Marnau isn't topped by Eggers. Like, the Marnau version is much more effective. In fact, there's two scenes, both in a sense involve traveling. Two iconic scenes from the original movie that Eggers recreates, and it just doesn't have the same effect. And I think, well, in at least one, he does exactly the same shot. In the other, I think he almost feels like it would be redundant to do that shot, so he tries to do it slightly differently, but he still does it, so it's still redundant anyway. The other thing, final thing to end on, in favor of the 1922 version, though, it's not a competition. I think the Nosferatu character in Marnuau's version is scarier. It's actually scary. Like, it's interesting to know, at least in my mind, how it's really about how something is delivered. It's about how it resonates with you. It's about the impact that it has on you. It's not necessarily about how it's done, as in, obviously, budget wise, facility wise, logistics wise, they had so much more at their disposal in the 2025 film. But in the 1922 film, the actual energy and the power that comes across on the screen when you're viewing the character, maybe it's the lack of technology that makes it gritty, that just adds that extra layer of menace and fear and palpable terror that really brings, I was going to say the character to life, but it's kind of an undead character, so that wouldn't probably be the correct description, but hopefully you get my meaning. But yeah, he's a motherfucker, that Nosferatu.